Well, while my friends are getting wired, or no, excuse me, I didn't mean that. Just a slip of the tongue. I'm Al Simpson, Director of the Institute of Politics, and welcome to the forum. And tonight we attempt to discuss and bring light to what has been a delicate and often controversial subject matter throughout our nation's history. It's the faith factor in American politics. Our political leaders have often consulted with spiritual leaders. For instance, the Reverend Billy Graham, who spoke here was a guest here at this forum last semester, has been a spiritual advisor to presidents of both parties for the past 30 years or more. More recently, our political leaders in Washington went into a bit of a religious tug-of-war over who should be appointed as chaplain of the United States House of Representatives. If they had nominated Father Robert Dryden, it would not have been a controversy at all. And, of course, the names of Pat Robertson, Al Sharpton, and Jerry Falwell have been often mentioned, and not always in favorable terms, during the current election cycle. Sometimes the topic of a candidate's faith has been shunned, avoided, and generally not discussed by the press or the candidate. And of course, at other points in our history, a candidate's faith has been given wide coverage. And I know that this will be shocking to some, but some have even exploited this for their electoral advantage. No Republican, of course, has ever done that. Oh, no, where were we? No, these are my notes. This year, we're in the midst of an election with two candidates publicly embracing their Christian faiths, and thus a Christian panel. And unlike in years past, our presidential candidates are openly speaking about their religion, their personal relationship to God, their experience of being born again, and even their conversions. And the question, can and should candidates' faith be a topic of discussion in the coming campaign? Should faith-based organizations form a partnership with government to address the nation's pressing social issues? Well, tonight we have a remarkable group of individuals to engage us in this engrossing topic. On my far right, only but physically, is Jim Wallace, an author, preacher, activist. He is editor-in-chief of Sojourners, a magazine reporting and analyzing the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. Reverend Wallace is also the convener of Call to Renewal, a national federation of churches and faith-based organizations working to overcome poverty and revitalize American politics. He's been a good friend of the Institute of Politics, the author of a new book entitled Faith Works, Lessons from the Life of an Activist Preacher. Jim's book explores the faith factor in politics and describes the increasingly important role of faith-based organizations in the public debate in solving vexing social problems. His book also suggests that we may be on the verge of a new social movement to correct the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, and to include those left behind in an age of prosperity, a cause to lead in part by religious communities. The next panelist, Father Robert Dryden, a priest, lawyer, politician, and activist. For 14 years, Father Bob Dryden was a law professor and dean of the law school at Boston College, a position he relinquished when he was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1971. I had the great personal privilege to come to the Senate in 1979. He had been there 8 years. He was a tremendous help to me as a young freshman. He was a skilled legislator, a passionate debater, spirited, wise, witty, and a joy to work with. And he served in Congress for 10 years, stepping down after the Pope issued an edict discouraging priests from holding elected office. And this was a man then observing the depth of his faith and calling when that came down. Father Dryden is the author of a number of books, including God and Caesar on the Potomac, A Pilgrimage of Conscience, shocking book and title itself, and The Fractured Dream, Stories from the American Soul. Reverend Jeffrey Brown is the pastor of the Union Baptist Church in Cambridge. He is co-founder and chair of the board of directors at the 10-Point Coalition in Boston. Reverend created Positive Edge, which provides street and court advocacy for at-risk youth in Cambridge. He participates in a variety of community organizations, including the Black Jewish Roundtable for the City of Boston, the Mayor's Commission on Unity and Justice in Cambridge, and the Cambridge African American History Project. Reverend Brown is currently working on a book on the history of black church in American politics. And on my far left, surely not part of a vast left-wing conspiracy in any way, is E.J. Dionne, one of the country's foremost experts on the issue of religion and politics. Senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a columnist for the Washington Post. His areas of expertise include elections, conservative and liberal ideology, and the role of religion in solving social problems. He is the author of a number of books, including Why Americans Hate Politics and They Only Look Dead, Why Progressives Will Dominate the Next Political Era. This is another shocking book. And is the editor of the forthcoming, quote, What's God Got to Do with the American Experiment? And this should be a very remarkable panel with remarkable insights, and we'll start in the order of introduction, 5 to 6 or 7 minutes each, and then opening it to view of the public. Please, Jim.
Thank you, Ellen. I'd like to begin with a story that my wife tells. She's an Anglican priest ordained by the Church of England. It's about one of her colleagues who was nervous as a young priest about his first Sunday school class. He was worried about being accepted by the kids. Though he was young himself, he hadn't been a kid for a while, and he was worried about being casual and kind of hip, so he leaned against the altar and he said to them, "Okay, kids, what's gray and furry and gathers nuts and climbs up and down trees?" And the kids looked puzzled. The little boy raised his hand and he called on him. And the kid was really struggling. He was really wrestling. He said, "I know the answer is supposed to be Jesus. but it sure sounds like a squirrel to me." I love that story because it suggests that there are no easy religious answers to hard political questions. Let's get that straight right off the bat. Nonetheless, there's a new acronym about. It's called FBO, Faith-Based Organization. When you become an acronym, you become nervous. Some of us have been doing this work for a very long time, and now it seems we've been discovered by the media, by academia. There's courses here. I teach one on faith, politics, and society. It's a hot topic, this FBO stuff. The candidates are talking about it. As Senator Simpson said, they're talking about their devotion to Jesus, some of them, but you know, the kids wore the bracelet. You know, what would Jesus do? I wish the candidates would wear that. What would Jesus say or do about record prosperity and rising inequality at the same time? We'll let E.J. talk about the candidates. I want to talk about what's closest to my heart, which is the agenda of the faith-based organization. I think these new partnerships that they're all calling for could be significant to revitalize civil society, maybe move beyond the old solutions of left and right, and find what we're looking for at the grassroots, which are answers, things that really work, that are right, and that work. But there are pitfalls about government's legitimate role being put aside, about churches and synagogues becoming social service agencies and losing their role as prophetic interrogators of a society. And I want to lift up just a couple of images, and then we'll talk about this tonight. I think faith-based organizations have the role of placing on the agenda issues that aren't there. Now, I have an 18-month-old little boy and an English wife who hates American football. She likes English football, which is our soccer. And so I think soon she and I will be a soccer mom and dad. Soccer moms are on the political agenda. But I want to suggest there's another mom that isn't on the agenda in these days. A woman, one of our staff, met at a local Burger King restaurant in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago. She was at the drive-in window, and she was moving back and forth to a table in the corner where there were 3 kids sitting. And the Sojourner's editor realized these were her kids. She was helping them with their homework at 4 in the afternoon at the Burger King, between cars at the drive-in window. Burger King mom is not on the political agenda, and soccer mom is. She's working hard and full-time, but she's still poor. And she's trying to figure out buying her kids winter boots or paying the rent or childcare. Now, we have an investment in helping her make her family work, but she's not on the agenda. The role of faith-based organizations is to put Burger King mom on the agenda. Another image. I know a lot of you, like myself, spend your spare time reading in biblical archaeology. Am I right? Yeah. Well, I was reading an article the other day in biblical archaeology, and it said that when they dig down in the ruins of ancient Israel, they find times when the artifacts show the houses were relatively the same size, and the instruments of life show a sort of a relative equality between the people. And during those times, there were no prophets. The prophets were silent. No Amos, no Jeremiah, no Isaiah. When they find other times when the remains show huge houses and small shacks and the artifacts show great disparities, that's when the prophets thundered the judgment and justice of God. NPR last week said Seattle now has 9 billionaires and 10,000 millionaires in one city, but the public schools are crumbling. I was having dinner with Yvonne Delk before this session, and we talked about how that when you're in good times and you're riding the crest of the wave, it's easy to forget those who are slipping beneath the sea and who are drowning. The 2 big issues in this campaign, I think, are not Bob Jones University, nor the religious right. They're declining in influence. The 2 issues for me are these. The increasing role of faith-based organizations, not just in providing social services, but in shaping public policy. And number 2, the remarkable unity that we're now finding among churches across the political spectrum on this issue of poverty. The Call to Renewal convened a remarkable gathering on these Capitol steps a few weeks ago where conservative evangelicals, Roman Catholic bishops, mainline Protestants, black churches and white churches were saying, we're covenanting to overcome poverty together. That hasn't happened for about 150 years when the churches were together on anything. We're very divided. But on this issue, we may be coming together. That question, I think, is the one that's before us. I do think, as Reverend Simpson said, that we're on the verge, we may be on the verge of a new movement around economic justice in this country. And that reminds me of the old question that was asked of Mark Twain if he believed in infant baptism. Funny thing to ask Mark Twain. Mark Twain said, believe in it? Hell, I've seen it. That's how I feel when I'm asked, do you believe there could be a movement for economic justice in this nation? I say believe in it, but because I'm an evangelical, I say heck. I'm beginning to see it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim.
Bob?
We probably wouldn't be here if George Bush hadn't said that he was born again, and if he didn't feel that he had to apologize to the Catholics. As you recall, he wrote a letter to Cardinal O'Connor saying, I'm not anti-Catholic, my brother's a Catholic. Well, it's so nice to be welcomed that now the new no-no is you can't be anti-Catholic. I'm kind of a little annoyed because I thought that the framers had settled this question. In Article 6, they said very categorically, no religious test shall ever be required for public office. And I can imagine the 55 white men, the framers of the Constitution, sitting there, say, we're going to get rid of the Falwells forever. And they put it right into the Constitution, the only time they ever mentioned religion in the Constitution. But here we are fighting the battle that was fought just 200 years ago when the Federalists, largely from New England, I'm sorry to say, said that Thomas Jefferson shouldn't be president because he's an infidel, an atheist, a non-believer, he doesn't even go to church. And thank God they lost. But we have a modern abuse of this whole thing, and it dates roughly from 1980, when Reverend Falwell, by his own admission, went to Detroit where the Republicans were gathered, and he persuaded Ronald Reagan to change the platform of the GOP so that they came out pro-life, for religion in the public schools, and also for federal aid for church-related schools. And that the GOP won in part on that platform in 1980. And George Bush says that, well, we have to cultivate this same group. Well, I don't think that's going to happen. And I think the new thing that no one really knows yet or realizes, there's 100 million Americans who are not affiliated with any church. They're not non-believers, but they don't go to church. And that most of our best friends are in that category. And that when they see people referring to Jesus, and they're opposed to that. That's totally alien to everything that they want. And in the Catholic community, I think that there's a lot of vibrations. What do they want? I can't predict anything that 62 million American Catholics want, but there's a small group of them that want to recriminalize abortion, and some of them, I suppose, would vote for George Bush just on that. There are probably 40 to 50% of these Catholics who do, in fact, want federal aid for church-related schools. They're hurting. They want their children, and there's 3 or 4 million children in that category. And the Catholic bishops are very opposed to the death penalty, and just a month ago, the Catholic bishops wrote to President Clinton begging him to declare a moratorium on the death penalty. I have an article coming out on the Catholic press next week suggesting that President Clinton do precisely that, declare a moratorium on the death penalty on Good Friday. Wouldn't that be dramatic, huh? Well, the question, it seems to me, has changed, at least as it comes up. And when Mr. Bush says that my life has been transformed by Christ, is he, as someone suggested, playing the Jesus card? He probably didn't mean it that way, but that he has to appeal to the religious right, the Christian coalition, the moral majority, all of that group that got President Reagan elected. Well, I think that it's a different ball game, and that I don't know what we're going to see for 7 months. All I can say is that people should say, we believe in the Constitution, and there's one thing clear: no religious test shall ever be required for public office. And I believe with Jim that whether you're a believer or not, we should focus on the real issues. The president is not running, the candidate not running to be preacher, they're running to be president. And what about a sensible foreign policy in the world after communism? What about helping the poor nations? 800 million people are chronically malnourished. What about health care for everyone? The statistics are awful and getting worse. The 40 million people without any insurance. And what about the 32 million African Americans? Every 8th American has his ancestry in Africa. We've talked about affirmative action, all types of things. But the fact is that half of those children are living in poverty. That is one of the issues, and I hope we can have a good debate about that. And what about a guaranteed good education for all of the children of America? They're hurting. Millions of them are in poverty in resegregated schools. I don't want to talk about God or religion or what these people believe. I think that we should say that the faith factor shouldn't exist in a presidential campaign. So I'm not thrilled at the title here about the thing. We should say that we should get back to the very serious issues that confront the country and the world. But I'm happy that you called for this, because I hope that there can be some clarification. My hope today is that religion is not going to be mentioned in the rest of the campaign. Well, that may be too idealistic and foolish and unrealistic, because President Bush has to get to those people in the South. And I've debated these people, Ralph Reed and Falwell and Pat Robinson, and I know that they want to get out of this. They say that their touch on anybody now is deadly. and that they are contaminated by all the atmosphere. And George Bush probably realizes that. So once again, as a Catholic, I feel that, well, it's nice to be cultivated, and that they wouldn't think that they are anti-Catholic, and they have to tell us this. A lot of people have told me, I'm not anti-Catholic. You know, my cousin was a Catholic. Like George Bush saying, my brother is a Catholic. So all I can say is that in the 7 months we should be very calm and cool and reflective. And let me close by repeating that wonderful Article 6. No religious test shall ever be required for public office.
Reverend Jeffrey Brown.
I'm going to try to pray to God for a miracle, and as a Baptist preacher, be as brief as I can. It could last a while. But as our illustrious speakers were speaking, and as I listened to the introduction by our moderator, I couldn't help but think about, from my own experience, couldn't help but to think what all the fuss is about. Because from the African American experience, there's always been a melding, if you will, of religion and politics. And our experience has helped to shape public policy. The civil rights movement, of which I see one of our local legends, Virgil Wood, in the audience, helped to change public perception about people of color in this nation. And I didn't get involved in this whole issue of crime and punishment, if you will, intentionally in order to shape public policy. It's a pastor in this area, and a kid got killed not too far from the church building. And I realized that there was an entire generation of young people who, although they were only a few years younger than I, they were separated by this vast gulf. There was a world that I didn't know and I didn't understand. And they didn't understand my world. And so I decided to get involved in trying to figure out a solution in order to bring peace to a neighborhood and to my community. And I realized that as I got out into the streets and started to deal with youth, kids involved in gangs, kids involved in drugs, whatever, I realized that I had a voice that would be able to help them through the situation that they were in. And that by building partnerships with the police and with probation and with the court system and talking with city government and eventually state government, that I realized that as we all came together to talk about this issue of violence, that I had a very intricate contribution to make, that when you look at the roots of violence, the social roots of violence, the political roots of violence, the economic roots of violence, that there were also moral and spiritual roots to the violence as well. And it was to that that I could contribute and give voice to. So when we talk about this debate of public policy and religion and how it's shaped, we should also talk about the dimensions of it and ask the question, how should it properly be shaped? Should it be shaped from above or should it be shaped from below? As I said, in the African American community, there's always been this blurred line between the sacred and the secular. That they're in the human experience, there's a social dimension as well as a sacred dimension. And both elements must be addressed in our nation's experience. I believe it was the late Cardinal Bernardine who said that the church is separate from the state, but the church is not separate from society. And so there's a tension there that we must appreciate and understand if we're ever going to come to some kind of resolution in this whole debate. And finally, there's a good friend of mine, visionary person. His name is Eugene Rivers. Some of you may know him. He is a very colorful personality. Let the church say amen. But one thing that he said to me and to others that I'll never forget, that when we look at the institutions of communities and as we see them disintegrate, there are precious few institutions left that would be able to grapple the multidimensionality of restoring communities and dealing with the experiment of trying to bring everyone together so they could live together. And that faith-based institutions are the strongest ones that we have. That's it.
EJ?
My prayer sitting here was, dear God, why were you so unfair to me as to make me speak after a Baptist preacher? I think we should first of all say we're grateful for the Reverend Senator Simpson's moderation. Kathy McLaughlin, who runs this place, said, this is going to be great. Not only will, no one is going to get out of line, let alone start a religious war with Simpson running the thing. And, if any of us decided to proclaim 95 theses, I could imagine Senator Simpson quoting some mordant line like Lincoln's great line, "Never have I seen a man compress such a small thought into such a large number of words." And so when it's time for me to shut up, just say Lincoln, and I'll know the time has come. Because I am a Catholic and I'm more or less on the progressive side of things, I always like to remind my friends that the religious right cannot be either blamed or credited with creating this link between religion and politics. And I love a story that Bishop Hubbard of Albany, New York, tells about Mrs. O'Reilly being taken to the polls. Anyone here who grew up as a Massachusetts Catholic will relate to this story. And she's being taken to the polls by her son. She's raised him to be successful. He is very prosperous and therefore votes for a lot of Republicans, but she still votes straight Democratic. And on the way to the polls, the son says, Mom, how are you going to vote? And of course she says straight Democratic. And the son says to the mother, Mom, if Jesus came back to earth and ran as a Republican, you would vote against him. And Mrs. O'Reilly said, oh, hush, why should he change his party after all these years? And I also think that it's important to note that pandering in the name of religion is not a new thing in America, and that occasionally pandering can be entertaining. And I think one of the best stories on that is Huey Long, who went all over the state of Louisiana. He needed the Catholic vote, and he would go to a Catholic audience, and he'd tell the story of his grandparents. He said, I'm a Baptist, but my grandparents were Catholic, and every Sunday I would hitch up my buggy, and I'd take them to Mass, and I'd go to Mass with them, and I'd take them home. And Huey Long carried the Catholic vote, probably because he promised aid to Catholic schools more than this story, but he did carry the Catholic vote. And after the election, he's having lunch with a friend who said, gee, Huey, I never knew that your grandparents were Catholic. And Huey Long looked the friend straight in the face and said, hell, I didn't even own a buggy. So whenever you're about to attack a candidate, remember, this is a very old tradition. I think it's not surprising that the issue we're discussing here tonight is so divisive, because I think it goes to the heart of how a lot of Americans understand the meaning of America and our freedoms. I think there were really two views in play, and I don't think there are two views that are contradictory, but I think they're very powerful among us. In one view, it's America's pluralistic and secular constitution that promoted freedom, diversity, and oddly, the very strength of American religion. A state independent of organized religion turned out to be freedom and religion's finest friend. And was it not a central motivation for the creation of free institutions? Was not a motivation for that a desire to end wars over God and religion? In the other account, freedom itself is rooted in a theistic account of the world. Some say a Judeo-Christian commitment to the inviolable dignity of the human person. This belief arises in the words of our own Declaration of Independence from the law of nature and of nature's God. A belief in God places healthy restraints on the human tendency to deify political systems or individual political strongmen, and insists that even strongmen are accountable to a higher authority. Now, this argument is as old as our republic, and as I say, in truth, the two views are not mutually exclusive. I'm sure we won't resolve it tonight, and perhaps we never will. As Alan Wolfe, who's now teaching over at BC, wrote 200 years after the brilliant writings of Madison and Jefferson on the topic, Americans cannot decide, cannot make up their minds whether religion is primarily private or public or some uneasy combination of the two. But precisely because of the ambiguities Wolfe describes, I think arguments about the role of God and religious faith in our democracy will always be central to our understanding of its workings. Now, I think the first thing we need to admit is that we Americans, almost all of us, can be quite inconsistent in our views of how and when religion should influence politics. Many who welcome the prophetic role of the churches in movements to abolish slavery, promote civil rights, and promote social justice are very skeptical of those who see the church's prophetic role as affecting our laws about abortion or family life. Jerry Falwell himself noted that he had been inconsistent on this subject. Jerry Falwell condemned the involvement of preachers in politics when Martin Luther King was organizing the civil rights movement, and then, of course, later took a different view when he became involved in politics just a few years later. I think there can be no doubt that the subject we're talking about tonight will be central to the campaign. George Bush and Al Gore, as the Reverend Senator Simpson mentioned, are talking enthusiastically about what government can do to help faith-based institutions. I think that's happening in part for the reasons the Reverend said, that a lot of people who have been working hard at solving social problems in our inner cities for a long time have discovered that the churches are among the most powerful forces both for social change and personal transformation that we have available to us in our society. And I think it's a very promising thing that the very importance of these institutions in transforming our inner cities has forced people to kind of reevaluate how they look at their own views. I think that the power of these churches has sort of forced conservatives to rethink what do they want to do about the poor, and I think their power has forced liberals to rethink what should our attitude be toward the churches. That would be the happiest outcome, I think, of this discussion if each side learned those two lessons. And it's worth saying that this subject has been on the radar screen for a long time. Pastors dealing with social problems, I refer to the good Reverend Rivers, are landing on the covers of national magazines, and scholars are predicting a new great awakening of religious fervor in the country. Now, I don't think that what we need to worry about is that the wall of separation is tumbling down. I don't think we're about to chuck religious freedom, impose censorship, or herd everyone into a church, synagogue, or mosque, let alone into an FBO. Indeed, I think it's partly because of advances in religious freedom, the result of court decisions and cultural changes during the 60s, that it's even possible to talk about increased cooperation between religious institutions and public life. I also think we should remember over and over that these battles are not new to us. In 1844, 6 people were killed in a riot in Philadelphia over which version of the Ten Commandments should be posted in the public schools. And whatever one thinks of today's battles, we are not doing anything that disturbing yet. I want to close with 2 points. I believe right now we are at a special moment in this debate, a moment I describe as the third stage in our great national debate over religious liberty. The first stage involved the creation of a religiously tolerant political order, but it was an order that existed under what you might call white Protestant hegemony. White Protestant hegemony, the first stage, began to erode during Prohibition and the Scopes trial. It's worth remembering that Prohibition is the last great political movement that united evangelical Christians with mainline churches. With the failure of Prohibition, the victory, the nomination of Al Smith, the victory of Franklin Roosevelt, this began to erode, and I think the predominance of Protestantism was largely repealed in the 1960s, often, it should be noted, with very strong support from progressive Protestants themselves. I think the second stage involved a hard push for separation, including many of the relevant court decisions, and I think the third stage is where we are now, where we're trying to figure out how to preserve the gains in religious liberty that happened in the second stage in this great period, and at the same time try to use those court decisions in a way that doesn't exclude religion from the public square and that acknowledges its central role in our national life. I think people can come to public arguments with religious motivations in mind, but they need to respect the views of others, and we are trying to find that balance right now. I think it's a promising debate because we Americans never forget about the importance of religious liberty. And thank you for not saying Lincoln.
I didn't. Thank you. All right, brothers and sisters, gather by the microphones and start firing away. And you can ask any question of the panel as a collective panel or to an individual. And if you'll just step forward and give your name, and hopefully many of you will be part of the student body, and if not, that's fine too. But yes, right here, this young lady.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Wood. I'm a junior at the college, and my question is particularly for those of you panelists who may come from or be familiar with the evangelical tradition. My first question is, I'm making an assumption that out of that evangelical Christian tradition, you would have a certain assumption about a single religious way to salvation, that being Jesus Christ, and how you work with others, either of diverse religious backgrounds when you're talking about collaborating with people of faith. Do you have a conflict between what you feel is your own personal belief and how you are acting out of that belief on social problems? And the reason I ask this is because in conversations with friends and others who come from more evangelical traditions, there's often an attitude that ultimately the social problems or economic justice problems that we have in America or in the wider world will not come to an ultimate resolution until sort of people's souls are saved, until they come to really know God in this way, and not until then will they make the types of decisions that will redistribute wealth or that will support the types of social policies that I know many of you are working on. So my question to you is how you have worked with others of diverse faith traditions or others within a Christian tradition who may not hold so strongly to this doctrine of salvation, how you have been able to communicate with them to work on these social problems.
Well, anyone ready and game for that?
I'm being pointed to because I'm a professed evangelical Christian. I always find it interesting that, the point of view is when people get themselves saved, then they'll do all these things, redistribute wealth and all the rest. Well, I haven't seen that. If that was working more effectively, I'd probably be more in favor of the strategy. The country, I used to always say, what country are there more born-again Christians per square foot? And the truth was it was South Africa, where the white majority believed in that kind of theology, but they weren't doing what the theory says. I'm a 19th century evangelical. Meaning the evangelicals who linked revivalism with abolitionism, slavery, or child labor law reform, or women's suffrage. The idea of faith leading to social reform was part of the evangelical tradition. In the last century, we got lost in the stupid chasm between private piety and social responsibility. We're finally overcoming that now. The beginning of a new millennium, I'm seeing conservative evangelicals, as EJ was saying, recognizing that the poor are a central biblical issue. And the kind of schism is being healed, I think, now. But the question of working in a pluralistic democratic society is not a problem. if you know that to overcome poverty, for example, the churches can't do this by themselves. We need all other traditions and government and labor and business, and the new partnerships we're talking about are going to be multi-sector dialogues and collaborations in which everybody is who they are but works together for the common good.
Jeffrey, did you have a comment?
Yeah, it's more on a practical level. I remember being at a retreat in Tennessee where it was a gathering of folk who wanted to know a little bit more about this on-the-ground kind of ministry that some of us were doing. And there was a person who was there who was he called himself evangelical bordering on fundamentalist. And you know, he said he was in an inner city. I won't name the city because there may be somebody here, you may know him. But he said that, you know, I'm out on the streets, I'm doing everything that you're saying that that we should be doing, but, you know, nobody's responding to me. So I said, so how long have you been out there? He said, been out there for 2 years. I said, well, what have you been doing? And with further prodding, I discovered that what he was doing is he was going out with his Bible and walking up to people and beginning to talk with them and relate scriptures to them. And I said to him, do you know who they are? Have you asked them their name? Do you know where they live? Have you done anything to build any kind of relationship with them? And that's a fundamental problem when you talk about those who have that narrow sense of, well, you know, Jesus Christ is the only way. It's almost that it's devoid of relationship. And Jesus was one of the most political leaders in the Bible, in the scriptures, but he was also one of the most relational. I mean, he reached out to people of other faiths and of other ethnicities and talked with them from where they are, and didn't try to do the whole kind of strong arm kind of you know, evangelization, but basically witnessed with his life. And what I said to him, you have to be the Bible. And so what he thought that meant was, well, I need to memorize as many scriptures as I can. I said, no, that's not it. You have to witness through your life. You have to speak from where you are. You have to talk about the situation and the circumstances, and hope that you know, and I hope that he gets to the understanding that it's not about the verses, but it's about morality, it's about ethics, and that's universal.
Quickly,
I think it's a great question, and one of my favorite biblical passages is from James, faith without works is dead. And I think most evangelicals, all Christians, contemplate that line a lot. And in my experience, the kind of person you are describing, a person of deep faith who believes that the personal relationship with Jesus Christ is necessary to do right, that can be the beginning and not the end of the story. And I think a lot of people who are in that category, and Jim is one of them, and a lot of the people Jim works with are like that. Basically, if you believe that, you end up with sort of two obligations. One is an obligation toward personal behavior. You got to do right. You got to take responsibility for your life. You got to act right by others. But that immediately leads to the second question, which is, what social result does that have? What does it mean to do right by others? What are my personal obligations to the broader society? And when Jim talked about the anti-slavery movement growing out of the evangelical churches, it was because there was serious reflection on the part of precisely the kinds of folks you're talking about on how this personal sense of conversion translated to their social obligations. So that I think that we may be at an odd historical past where we've lost a little of that, but at least I, who does not speak as an evangelical, does not see that link as being inconsistent with being an evangelical.
Robert, did you have a quick comment?
It's a very good comment and question. There's 20 to 30 million evangelicals in this country. And frankly, I never really heard much about them until they became political in 1980. And I think the senator put it well, or someone, that they became political because they saw with envy Dr. Martin Luther King. These people have never been in the National Council of Churches. They're outside the mainstream. I don't know whether they want to keep it that way, but they're very anxious about their schools. The last count I saw is that they have 19,000 day schools in the South. And Falwell boasted 2 or 3 years ago that we're establishing 1,000 new schools every year. They have great troubles with the gays, and I hear them, that they're in pain over this, that this, in their interpretation, is against the scriptures. They are anti-Catholic in ways that we thought were gone forever. and they have troubles with the Jewish community. I think that we ought to talk with them insofar as you can. They're much more Christian than many of the Catholics that I know. They're very profoundly religious people, and that they probably have been misunderstood. I don't think, in my view, that they have been forthcoming in talking with us. But I'm glad that you raised that, and that maybe after this campaign, there'd be a new understanding, I hope, of these people.
Question, sir? Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. Grateful for these presentations, and I'm delighted that you've helped so much. I'd like to make a contribution tonight. I don't know if you've designated anyone to take the offering yet.
Although we are.
Father Dryden is going to take the second collection.
Virgil would. In my community, there is a saying, Jesse Jackson says that there's not really two parties in America, it's one. There's two wings. With respect to its attitude on a fundamental issue. In my community, there's a saying that goes something like this, that the Democrats, when they're in power, want to give us a fish. The Republicans, when they're in power, want to teach us how to fish. But the fact is that neither one wants to allow us to have our own fishing hole. Question. With respect to the uniqueness of the Christian message, the Jubilee justice content of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the one historical point that was taken with great seriousness was Karl Marx reading Acts 4:32-35. Misunderstood it, wrote Das Kapital, confused the world for almost 100 years. But the church is more to be blamed than that because it never engaged the issue of how do you deal with the vast economic inequities in society. And I would submit, my question is, how do you see, where do you see in either party the willingness to tackle the issue of coming to terms with the economic inequities in our society?
Thank you very much. Anyone?
Well, the candidates have said they want to enter into partnership with faith-based organizations. What we're saying back to them is if you want to partner with us, then you've got to put our agenda on the political agenda. For a long time, they've looked at the faith-based organizations, 10-Point Coalition, and all these others around the country, and they see it as shining examples, lovely anecdotes of what can be done. What if those lovely anecdotes magnified their collective voice around the agenda you're talking about? That's what the Called Renewal is trying to do, that very thing. April 9th, Jubilee 2000, you mentioned Jubilee. Debt cancellation, it's a grassroots movement started by faith-based organizations. Washington, D.C., a rally of 50,000 people. They're talking about canceling the debt. Jim Wolfenson of the World Bank now knows what Leviticus 25 says about this year of Jubilee of freeing slaves and canceling debt and giving land back. These are biblical ideas that are being talked about in terms of debt cancellation. So there's a living wage campaign. There's a sweatshop campaign in New York 2 nights ago with this book tour. We're having town meetings and not bookstores, town meetings of faith-based organizations who are doing this work. See, I think the work is being done on the ground. And like most movements, it will bubble up over time. But the candidates, I think, have to hear a clear message from the faith-based organizations. If you want to partner with us, we're not going to endorse you. But like the Civil Rights Movement said, we want you to endorse our agenda. And that agenda is putting Burger King Mom back in the conversation again.
This question? Yes.
Let me ask the panelists a somewhat controversial question, particularly about the relationship with the evangelical black churches of this country and the gay and lesbian movement in this country. I have two concerns. One is I don't think there's been enough discussion about AIDS in the black community and a kind of rivalry of disadvantaged groups with people in the African American community saying to me the gay and lesbian community got really mobilized about resources to fight AIDS. But we in the black community don't have access to those resources. And we in the gay and lesbian community saying, what took the 10 years to get into this dialogue about the concern? And I have been working in Oakland, California with a very interesting and multicultural situation. And I'm very worried that if we use faith-based organizations, there's some issues that are very hot-button religious issues. How can we have a full conversation about a disease that affects everybody? And how can we let go of some of our pre-assumptions about who gets that disease?
Please, whoever wishes to address that.
Well, since I represent the black evangelical, if I can answer that question, I hear you and I resonate with what you're saying. My colleagues within 10 Point have been addressing that issue for the simple fact that when you deal with issues of violence on the streets, you invariably deal with AIDS. And what we've discovered theologically, and I don't know where this all goes because it's still being developed, that when you get down into the grassroots and begin to deal with some serious grassroots issues such as violence, such as AIDS, et cetera, that it does some rethinking of where you sit theologically. Now, 10 years of silence has a lot to do with perceptions of the Bible and what it says about gays and lesbians, etc. However, there are ways in which there can be some addressing of the issues without letting it be a hot button issue on the religious side. Reverend Eugene Rivers tackled the issue head on by dealing with AIDS in Africa and made it an international issue, and it's growing. And so, there is a way in which you can deal with that, have a conversation without losing integrity one side or the other.
Anyone else care to deal with that? Interesting. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Tim Mathard. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And I think this follows up somewhat with Sarah's question, but getting a little more specific. And the comments that I've heard about the greater potential for working together in the public and faith-based sectors, it seems to me that we've had some opportunity to do this, considering the specific public policy of charitable choice passed back some 4 years ago in the Congress in the Welfare Reform Bill. And since that time, I understand there's maybe 2% or so of religious congregations that are in fact engaged in charitable choice. So it would seem to me that either the Congress made a mistake in pursuing that public policy, maybe made that decision out of some sort of political decision versus implementation hope, or the churches are not really responsive. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Why is charitable choice not working if there is this greater connection between the public and religious organizations?
Could I start on that?
Please, TJ.
I think charitable choice has to be put into a bigger context. The fact is that an awful lot more money, federal money, government money, has flown through religious institutions in a whole series of areas than we have acknowledged. There's an awful lot of child care money that for a long time, since I guess about 1990, has flowed through the churches. There's a lot of feeding money and feeding programs that has flowed through the faith-based organizations. A lot of homeless programs. You have government money going directly or indirectly through religious organizations. Catholic Charities, there's a dispute about the number, but something on the order of 60% of the money that goes through Catholic Charities funded groups comes from government. So charitable choice, I think, should not be seen as some huge departure we have run a lot of programs this way. I mean, when I was 15 years old, I volunteered at a Head Start program in a local Protestant church down in Fall River, where I grew up. So we've had much more cooperation than we like to let on. Second point, I don't know about that 2% number, and there are churches that have been reluctant to get into it, but there was a study by a guy called Mark Chavez down at the University of Arizona, which found a very interesting thing. Charitable choice was pushed mostly by political conservatives, but what he found in his study was that the churches who wanted to participate in these programs tended to be more liberal than the average church. They were also much more African American than the average church. Now, at some level, that shouldn't be surprising. The African American church has been deeply involved in social service for a long time, and the more liberal churches might be inclined to do so. To me, the challenge on this is, how are we going to write? Charitable choice is a real challenge, because you're trying to do almost a contradictory thing. You're trying to say that the government is prepared in areas where the churches have a real track record of helping people successfully. The government is going to try to let more of its money flow to these successful programs, but it's not going to do it in a way that coerces any individual who comes through the church, yet it does not want to disturb the religious character of the program. There's a person here at Harvard who teaches at the law school called Martha Minow, who is struggling with how do you write rules that are actually not nonsensical and that achieve these two very difficult ends. But I think charitable choice is going to be very difficult. I am one of those people who believes it's worth the gamble because of the good work that we know has already gone on, and because the communities that you're trying to serve are communities that surely need more help than they're getting, and that if this is one way not to cut help off here to throw it into the churches, but to expand the array of possibilities for people in the community, it is an experiment worth trying.
I regret that I didn't notice our good questioners up there, so I want to get to those. They've missed a round or two. Yes, Bob, and then Jim. Yeah, quick.
Let me just say that I'm very uneasy with the term faith-based institutions. They used to be church-related, and we knew exactly who they were. And they were Catholic or Lutheran or Jewish. And the constitutional law on this is relatively clear, that Catholic schools can have bus rides and secular textbooks, and the Supreme Court will decide soon whether they can have computers in Louisiana. We all want to encourage these things, and that the people who have faith say this is a need and we'll do it. But that deep down, I have the feeling that this is a cop-out by the government. All the faith-based units will do it, and we'll give them some money when they should be doing it. You may recall that President Reagan used to say, God, if all those churches out there, if they would just take 10 people. He said this. This is one of his fantasies. And that these things are around, that the churches should be doing this. And now we call them faith-based organizations. And that I want the Jewish home for the elderly to have whatever they're entitled to. And that all these other things. But I'm just uneasy about it. And that I followed very closely the charitable choices and everything that went into that bill. And a lot of people say that Mr. Clinton probably should have vetoed it, but that with all due respect to Jim and the people who like faith-based organizations, I say let us be cautious.
Aren't you a member of a faith-based organization? Oh, Catholic Church?
Quick question.
The definitive article on your question is in the next issue of Sojourners, written by the woman sitting right to your right, Holly Leibowitz, who answers your question beautifully in the article. But let me give my Mark Twain answer to that. I was in North Carolina 2 weeks ago. When the welfare bill passed charitable choice, the black churches marched into Governor Hunt's office and said, okay, we want to collaborate with you on this welfare to work stuff. And I have never seen such a good partnership as I'm seeing now in North Carolina. It's not churches saying, we're going to take up your responsibility. If anything, they're the advocates. They're the prophetic interrogators there, pushing how that TANF surplus money is spent, pushing what the state does on the issue of welfare reform. But I think government can't do it all. I think churches sure can't do it all. There's no sector who can do all this. So we have to do a new era of partnership here. I wish the press was asking and exploring your question in this campaign, which is a much more interesting topic than Bob Jones University. How these new partnerships might work. What are the church-state questions? What are to me, I'm with EJ, the biggest issue is not the church-state issue, but how church-related organizations can maintain their prophetic integrity in partnership with various levels of government. That's going to be the real test before us, I think.
But why do you say that the government can't do it all?
Oh, because
They're supposed to. The Constitution says in the preamble the government has to care for the general welfare.
And it should, but not every problem is best solved by a particular government program. There's lots of ways that a society solves its problems.
But also, Father, I think even if you believe, as I support a high level of social provision, there are a whole lot of problems that people have that are not simply economic, and I think that's where the churches have historically played a huge role in helping transform people's lives.
Yes, right.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Harpal Kohli, and I'm a sophomore at the college. And much has been said about the distinction between those in the political arena who stress the social justice teaching of their faith and those in the political arena who stress the family teaching of their faith, and of the sadly little overlap between the two. And a couple of you mentioned the two sides coming together. And what do you see in the future as bringing the two sides together and closing the distinction? And also, what can people on the two sides do to draw closer?
Well, this call to renewal conversation has been going on quietly for almost 5 years now, and we have those groups at the table now, and they are coming together because finally fighting for a living family income, which is one of our commitments, is a family issue. It's an economic issue, and it brings together the concerns of both sides. This false polarization on the left and right has prevented us from finding workable solutions on the ground. So my great hope is that we will come together and say, okay, how do we make it possible for that mother in Burger King for her family to make it? That's a family values issue. It's an economic justice issue as well. And that is happening now. That's my great hope as I see it.
And my optimism on this comes from the fact that I think a lot of progressives who are in no way intolerant against any other group in society says we have serious problems among the poor because of family breakdown, because of kids abandoned by a parent, or all kinds of things that we could talk about breaking up inside the family. And if you care about social justice, you have to worry about those problems. And I think liberals and progressives are much different in their view of that now than they were when they condemned Daniel Patrick Moynihan, say, in 1965 for raising this issue. I think on the conservative side, at least some people are willing to come to terms with the fact that, as Jim says, if you care about family values, you've got to care about social justice, and that the ability to find a job and to support a family is a central part of the inability to do that is a central part of the problem people have in being able to get married and to take care of their children. And I think the debate on that has moved forward, not as much as I would like, but a lot forward from where it had been a while ago.
Yes, right there.
Yes, there's been a lot of talk about bringing businesses and faith-based organizations and government together. Is there a workable solution that you have for how they could work together to solve poverty, for example?
There you are.
I think I'll do 10 seconds. I think businesses have acted as if they operate under the First Amendment. A lot of corporate philanthropy has been very reluctant to give assistance to inner city churches, to other kinds of churches, and that business could fill some of the hole that would be created if we take a very hard line on separation and say the government can't do this. Business can do some things the government can't do, has a freedom that government doesn't have in this sphere. James Q. Wilson proposed that religious organizations create a kind of faith-based united way to encourage a different kind of giving to these organizations. I think that could be a good thing, especially from my point of view, if it was directed toward organizations that were dealing with poverty.
There are more and more stories about that. One of them is in Raleigh, North Carolina. The Jobs Partnership is 80 churches going to local businesses and saying, you provide a job with a future and benefits, and we'll support that worker coming off welfare into that job. The church will walk with them for 2 years, like we've done with refugee families and the rest, to make sure they succeed in that job. They've found 800 jobs in Raleigh already just doing it that way. So it's a beginning kind of conversation, but I see the stories now emerging around the country.
Right here, question.
Thank you. My question is also about charitable choice. I want to come back to the discussion we were having a bit ago. We heard some hesitations about charitable choice, some fear that perhaps these faith-based organizations might become just another arm of the state bureaucracy, or they may not be doing the job quite so well as it's being hyped up to do. My understanding of charitable choice is that these organizations, these churches, can become service providers, but cannot use that same time to undertake evangelism. They cannot minister while at the same time running a soup kitchen. Now, my Protestant background has always taught me that you do a service like that only in the service of a ministry, that you only do that so that you can have the opportunity to form a relationship and begin preaching the word to them. So my question is, what would you think about getting rid of that little caveat in charitable choice and saying that the churches can, in fact, evangelize while running a service? This is coming from Governor Bush's campaign. That's one of his faith-based action proposals. What do you think of this?
I think that goes to the heart of the difficulty that charitable choice is going to face. I mean, my friend Martha Minow at the law school is very sympathetic to charitable choice, and she is worried. She's sympathetic. She has qualms, but she's sympathetic. She's worried that it's going to fall on constitutional grounds because it is very difficult to draw that line. Charitable choice is trying to say you can keep the religious symbols up in the room. You can talk to people. You don't have to kind of destroy the religious character of the institution, and yet you cannot make a willingness to be proselytized a condition for receiving the help. I know a gospel mission guy who once described himself as, we're the people who hit you over the head with the Bible and pour soup down your throat. And there are a lot of the gospel mission people who don't like charitable choice because they really want to hit you over the head with the Bible first. And are very and I say that with great respect. They do great work. And I think that is going to be a very tricky problem. But I don't see how charitable choice can pass constitutional muster if you impose on an individual certain restrictions in order to get government money passing through the faith-based organization. I think the court, even a rather conservative court, would strike it down. And so I think it's... Go ahead.
But so long as there is a secular alternative available, and so long as all the religions equally have the opportunity to compete for these state grants.
Just one question. We have so many. Thank you. Right here, please.
Yeah. As a Christian, one of the things that has bothered me is that I've noticed that this is a very segregated society, and that racial and class differences has played a big part on the debate on poverty. I've noticed that, as the saying goes, I have noticed it's true that one of the most segregated hours in America is on Sunday morning. I'm wondering what you're doing regarding racial reconciliation as part of the call to renewal.
Well, it's integral. It's overcoming poverty, dismantling racism. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. I mean, racism is still, the assumptions of white privilege are still central to the reasons for poverty. In my neighborhood, you just can't separate the poverty of the people there with the complete isolation of that population from the rest of the society. So I don't think you can have a conversation about poverty without talking about race. So this conversation, though, again, is encouraging to me because in some of the conservative evangelical circles that haven't talked about race, I got kicked out of my little church at 14 over the issue of race. And now those same white evangelicals are talking about your term, racial reconciliation, which also has to include racial justice, in ways they haven't for a long time. And that, to me, is a very encouraging thing.
Question up there, please.
Yes, my name is Megan Seibel, and I'm a freshman at the college. I'm curious to know about an issue that hasn't yet been raised tonight, and that is, what are faith-based organizations planning to do to move the agenda of human rights, and how does the church view its role in addressing this international political problem?
Human rights in which sense? Could you define what you mean by human rights? What you're particularly thinking of?
Sure. Just in general, pretty much, how does the church view itself, maybe cooperating with governments to help improve the quality of human rights?
Abroad or at home? I guess that's...
Abroad.
Okay.
International.
Well, I was in Seattle the night before the demonstrations in the cathedral, and it was full of 2,000 church folks around Jubilee 2000. Now, again, we're having Seattle East, or Seattle 2, with Jubilee 2000 again, and the IMF conference and demonstrations. Washington's very worried about this confrontation. It's union folks, it's environmental folks, but a lot of religious organizations are there as well. And they're saying, in fact, that the rules of global trade, the global economy, have to include a concern for worker rights and human rights. And so I think this is at the forefront of that agenda, and that's why you're going to see religious communities continuing now in the center of those kinds of conversations.
I think the churches in America are well organized and very active in carrying out the mission of America to implement internationally recognized human rights. And in the Congress in 1975, we finally got President Ford to sign the bill that mandates that in America, the United States may not give any aid of any kind to those nations that chronically violate internationally recognized human rights. The State Department puts out a document every February listing all the offenses around the world, and the churches have been extraordinarily active in that. In fact, the Congress last year or 2 years ago passed a new bill that says that the State Department has to have a separate office guaranteeing religious freedom all around the world, and the documentation from that group that now with a staff of 14 is quite impressive.
This is one of the few areas I think you've begun to see a real kind of cooperation across some of the old divides. Mm-hmm. It's not in that you've seen cooperation among sort of Catholics, evangelicals, mainline churches, Jewish groups, secular human rights groups, and China, the China debate this comes out all the time, this very broad cooperation. It doesn't always work neatly, and there are divisions, but I think, some of the strongest voices for human rights in Washington are the churches, the labor movement, and some of the traditional human rights organizations like Amnesty.
Question here?
Yes, my name is Shankar Swami. I'm a sophomore at the college. As a progressive, I laud the efforts of faith-based organizations to address the issues of economic inequality. But as a non-believer, my concern is that tied to the efforts of FBOs to address issues of economic justice is an effort to promote a particular religious viewpoint. Indeed, some of the panelists have suggested that that problems of poverty are not merely material in nature, but also spiritual in nature, and therefore require a somewhat spiritual solution, perhaps the promotion of a particular religious viewpoint. So my question to the panelists is, can we address these issues of, say, family values and morality, which I certainly accept are issues in dealing with poverty and in dealing with crime, in a secular way and through the government and through the state, as Father Dryden suggested, or do we necessarily need to inject particular conceptions of faith into the discussion in order to adequately address those problems?
You like that, didn't you?
Well, thank you very much. I wish I were running again. You'd be the campaign manager. Now, all I say is that I have this abiding suspicion that the religious right, beginning 20 years ago, said that we want to benefit, we want to get governmental assistance. Along with the very conservative people then in power, they said that, well, the government shouldn't be involved in this, that the groups, the church, that's always been the history of America. Well, there's a few truths in that, and gods, I want to help the churches to help their own people, but that I just have the suspicion that the government is copping out.
See, I think if people are talking about replacing basic social service with this,
sure.
It's not going to work. If the pretense is that, I always tell my conservative friends, gee, it sounds like you believe in original sin in every area of life except where the poor are concerned. In this area, you think we're so good that if the government pulls out, we're suddenly going to become hugely generous and everything will be solved. So I agree with your general premise on that side. I think on the other side, the issue is not we want the government running around promoting, trying to turn somebody into a Baptist or a Catholic or a Muslim. I think the issue is how can you have government policies that do not exclude the work of these groups, that provide secular alternatives, but that do not sort of rule out the possibility that certain kinds of service can be done through the churches. We'd shut down our healthcare system if we said Medicare can't go to Catholic hospitals. So I think it's a question of nuance. How do you protect religious freedom but encourage good work that's being done in these areas?
I think the conversation about America's political future will be a discussion about values. Some will approach those as religious values, some spiritual values, some moral values, but it's a values conversation that we're having now. It's not going to be so much a left-right conversation as a values conversation, and that should be a pluralistic, democratic conversation, and the religious folks should be a part of that, but can't and won't control that whole conversation, shouldn't.
I think I'm going to take just one more question. I'm going to ask the panel to give 1 minute summary and start from this direction. I'm going to take this young lady, and then I regret that, but it is past 9:15, and then each of the panelists starting 1 minute, just whatever thought you wish, starting here. And your question, please, if you could, as briefly as possible.
Thank you. My name is Kim Priori, and I'm wondering if any of you could address the role of the media in the emerging faith-based organizations, particularly in the coming campaign. And I'm looking, I think it's gotten some attention on the national level, but I'm looking more for a local level. I think it's no great shock to any of us that there's not a wealth of television crews here tonight. If someone were to get shot, I think we'd have a crew here in 10 minutes. And I'm in a very entry-level position at a local television station. By that I mean my shift starts in 3 hours. And so clearly if I had any influence, you can believe that would be the first thing I would change. So I'm wondering, I guess my question in some sense is, can television news be saved? Is there hope for it? And should I stick it out? Is it worth it for me to stay there and spend my night writing about car accidents and fires, hoping that someday I can have some influence on the news agenda and get these issues on the air? Or should I abandon ship and, go
Don't leave.
somewhere?
Don't leave. Stay. I mean, there are some very interesting experiments going on around the country in television news. There is enormous frustration in a lot of markets with the fact that a television station will go 100 miles to find a murder, but won't go 5 blocks to find a solution. And that there's I think it's WBBM in Chicago has completely ripped up its format and is not putting any gratuitous violence on. In other words, they're not covering serious crime. They're just not going to go 100 miles out of their way to find one so they can have something on television. And I think that part of this is going to be whether those things are commercially successful. And there are a lot of people rooting for WBBM. You almost want to buy stock in the company just to see if this experiment can work. And there are other stations that are trying to do that. So I don't think it's hopeless. But I think on your point about the media, which I am part of, I think it is one of the challenges of how can you make, and it just doesn't have to do with faith-based organizations, it's how can you sort of encourage not just problem reporting, but solution reporting. And there are a lot of people trying to think about that, but we are, most of us, all human beings, problem-oriented people. And the evidence is people tend to switch the channel because solution reporting tends not to be as exciting. And I think your challenge in your brilliant career will be to prove to us that you can make that kind of reporting as exciting as some of the traditional forms of reporting. That's the challenge as I see it.
Last word.
1 minute.
Can I, having just...
No, you only get one. Oh, no. Did you want to add a dimension to your last remarks?
I guess all I want to say is I am hopeful about this debate because, as I said, I think there's a chance of creating some conversation across divides and to get conservatives to care more about poverty, liberals to take seriously the work of non-governmental institutions. I do not believe these institutions can replace government, but I think they're an essential supplement. And I also think the interest in faith is central because religion, for an awful lot of people, is not just about giving meaning to their own lives. It gives them a point of view from which to question both themselves and the society. It gives them an optic from which to be critical, again, of both themselves and their society. It's a social power, and it allows people to ask and probe and create change. And that's why I want to salute my friend Jim Wallace in closing. I'm here in large part because Jim has his new book, and he asked me to come. I admired him before I met him. As Senator Simpson would know, there are public figures you sometimes admire a little more before you meet them than after you meet them. Jim is the other way around, and I really honor the work he's been doing.
Thank you. Reverend? Reverend Jeffrey Brown.
I like him too. I just want everyone to know that. In the next 50 years, this country is going to be facing some enormous shifts, increases in population and in ethnic diversity. If we don't start now trying to find viable solutions where we can all live together, then I shudder to think what we're going to be facing. And I think to that end, that faith-based institutions can make a strong and reasoned attempt to try to get everyone to understand that this United States is about all of us and not just a few.
Robert?
At the heart of the Judeo-Christian message is the idea that we should love every person, love every neighbor as ourselves. It's a very high standard. We could call that we all have to be good Samaritans. And somehow all of that got into the ethos of America. We don't call it religious. but we say that we care for every person. Every individual is unique. He's entitled to equal protection and due process and the care of all of us. And we carry that out to a large extent. We stumbled on African Americans. We're trying to rectify that. But we have an unusual level of being good Samaritans. The law says you don't have to be. We can't put you in jail if you're not. But that's the whole ethos of America. And in all the public schools, some version of that is communicated. The evangelicals and lots of Christians are afraid that we have to reinforce this with Christ-related sentiments. And that's all laudable. I do it myself on many occasions. But we have to say, what is the secular morality and who do we want to be in the next 20 or 40 years? And I think that we have a unique obligation to be humanitarian, to think of everybody. And it comes back really to the second commandment, that we have to love each other as our own. Call it anything that you want to, but the law wants to enforce basic equality, and that means every person, however humble, has a right to be equal. The person, the child who's disadvantaged, who has learning disabilities, the blacks who feel deprived of their culture, all of those people. You may say, well, it's too much, and a lot of people are shrinking back, say, we can't do that. But I would like to see this campaign focus on this. We as Americans, now that we're relieved of the obligation of fighting against communism, we have all of this wealth and this recovery and all these new millionaires. I hope that we get a vision from one or both of the presidents so that we would say that we're proud to be Americans.
Yeah. I confess I get impatient on these questions of economic justice, and I'm on this book tour now trying to talk to the media about poverty, and I'll tell you, that isn't a challenge. But I have a good friend named Vincent Harding who tells me this. He was involved in the civil rights struggle. Now he's an elder and historian and spiritual mentor to me. He says, you can't start a movement, but you can prepare for one. And he talks about how Rosa Parks wasn't just tired that day in December in 1955. She was going on retreat. She was going to the Highlander Center in the hills of Tennessee. She was getting ready for something. A whole generation of people felt like something was going to happen. Something was going to change, and they wanted to. She didn't know she'd light the spark, but she was getting ready. The rising tide is lifting all the yachts. Hasn't yet lifted all the boats. That gap is growing. I think that issue is going to become a central moral issue in this country. I'll tell you today, it's not for the media right now or the candidates, but it's people of faith, I think, not sectarian religion, but all kinds of faith, who have the power to put things on the agenda. So my exhortation is to think movement. Don't just think social services or charitable choice. Think about building social movements. The end of this book, Faith Works, is about how we need to, those politicians who have their wet fingers in the air trying to see which way the wind is blowing. The image I love these days is you can't just change one wet-fingered politician with another. You got to change the wind. That's what movements do. They change the wind. So if you care about these issues, let's be wind changers. Oh.
Well, thank you, especially to this panel. Let me just add, and I've been very good, haven't said anything, and that's my duty. But I think a few truths, two of them quickly. People should not quote from the Bible unless they have read it. It sounds so simple, but you'll find so many people say, I'll tell you what the Bible says. They've never even seen it. They don't even have it. That would be number one. The other would be, you come to know in life where to turn when you don't know where to turn. And you will all find that. All of you. That's it. You will find where to turn when you don't know where to turn. And faith in something bigger than yourself is the only way to get through this remarkable absurdity. And it's a positive absurdity, but it's fun, too. Thank you for a wonderful panel.
There's a reception, Robert.
And Robert is still...
Your reception?
Oh, wait a minute. Don't forget, we have Jim up here in the fine sod room with his book. And he will sign books after the forum here in the fine sod room, right? Whoop. Is this right, Bill? Up there in that corner. Thank you, Bill. Good panel. And Thank you, Robert, Jim.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
How are you?